In this lecture, we're going to be looking at personnel leadership. The first part of this was personnel management, and I talked a lot about hiring people, advertising, and just the process of making sure that you're really recruiting quality staff for the best quality that you can afford to get. So we're going to go over more firing, and then the process of terminating employment, and then I'm going to go over just the basics of some legal issues, grievance procedures, and discrimination. I do have a disclaimer. I did this in another class as well because I'm giving you the basic understanding of like EEO, protected classes, a lot of issues that have to do with discrimination and have to do with federal law, state law. So this is to just give you an overview of background and introduction. A lot of you might already be familiar with it, but if you're not, you need to use your own due diligence if you are going to be using any of this information in a professional capacity. So what I'm telling you cannot take the place of doing your own research with the federal government websites, which I'll go over. Perhaps consulting with a lawyer. There are ones online or ones that you can do hourly in order to reduce that cost. Meeting with HR people as well. A lot of us are lucky enough to have that built in with the nonprofit or the organization that we work on. Some of us are a little bit on our own, and so you have to go beyond this class if you are on your own. If you're a small business owner yourself, or that's what you are planning to do, you need to know this from yourself. I can just kind of introduce you to it, but none of this information can be used in a professional capacity on its own. So why I kind of called it personnel leadership is last time it was management. So what are the issues with recruiting, retaining, and hiring great staff? And I think what we show our leadership when we have to make those hard decisions about your program and about staff members. So I really think that is firing. A lot of times we do have to fire people, and it's never easy. It's always kind of a really hard thing to do. And I want to make sure that we're doing it correctly and fairly so that you can protect the employees that you already have. And you can protect your program as well from liability and just from somebody who maybe shouldn't be in that position anymore. I also am going to talk about grievance procedures. For many of us, if you're in a very large organization, you might not even know that you have grievance procedures, but they're most likely there. If you work for Head Start, for the federal government, and then a larger state government organization, you are going to have grievance procedures because it's basically built into the work that you do. So I'm going to go over that. If you are larger, you might want to consider having grievance procedures, or you might just kind of want to be introduced to the idea of it as well. Because it is something that we can use with staff, our own staff, our employees. Suppliers often use it, and that's why it's kind of built into like federal government and state government large programs. And then families already as well can use grievance procedures. So why is firing important? First of all, it's a non-productive business relationship. So we are paying somebody to do a job for us. If they can no longer fulfill the functions of that job, then they need to not be employed by you. So, you know, staff members such as janitors, I had someone for quite a few years, and he just became less and less able or willing to fulfill the requirements of the job. Once again, it was a huge center, 350 kids. He was one of 3 staff members who are janitorial staff. He worked during the day, doing laundry, mopping up floors, sweeping, edging, you know, that type of stuff. And as it became more and more clear that he would not keep up with those kind of duties, and was trying to do other things, we needed to put him on a couple of plan of actions. You know, this is your job contract. These are your essential job functions. These are the things that you need to do. If you can't do that, we can't continue to put that on the other staff members who are also janitors, because you don't want to do it anymore. And so eventually we had to fire him. I'll also talk about times that I've had to fire teaching staff members as well. So we did, in this case with our janitor, he did have a detailed plan of action about things that he needed to do, when he needed to do them, by what part in the shift laundry needed to be done, or what day of the week edging needed to be done, that type of thing. But then he kind of really showed us through our supervision, so going out and make sure and monitoring to make sure that these things were done, that he was not willing to keep up with the demands of the job anymore, and so he did need to be let go. So that's kind of how you show your leadership. We could have kept this person. We had 2 other people, but it wasn't for those other 2 people that they needed to pick up the slack that he wasn't doing. It was an entire paid position by the federal government that was going mostly unused. So that was a big waste of money as well. Benefit, I mean, it was probably $50,000, $60,000 a year the federal government was spending on him, on raises, on benefits for a job that he was unwilling to do. So in that case, we needed to show leadership in a money-saving way, that it wasn't fair to the other people, and it wasn't fair to my program that wasn't looking as good as it could or had in the past, because he wasn't keeping on top of it. You know, smells were starting to add up. The infant room trash wasn't being taken out when it should have been. Sometimes the floors got really sticky in the school age room after they had left to go to school in the morning. So, you know, that's kind of how we had to show our leadership, was by saying, you know, this isn't working. You've been given the chance to change and you haven't chosen to do that. So we're going to have to end this business relationship. We're no longer going to pay you to do something that you weren't willing to do. But I do want to touch on the fact that there's 2 types of termination, and I kind of like the image. On the left-hand side, voluntary termination, you're retiring, yay, 40 years of service or whatever, and you get to go and use those pensions and those benefits you've worked so hard at. Quitting, maybe you're going back to school, maybe it's the birth of a child. You know, there are great reasons that you could be leaving a job. And then resigning as well, maybe you're moving on to something bigger and better, you're just making a career change. So typically a voluntary termination is quite happy. But involuntary is where you get the sad face. It's typically when you are fired. You are not voluntarily leaving that position. We are making you leave the position. So what if an involuntary position, an involuntary termination, it's job performance? So we're going to kind of go over 2 different ways, when you have to do it immediately and then when you can work on a performance plan. So for all staff, not just new hires, you are going to engage in a process of informal supervision and mentoring. So making sure that the essential job functions are being achieved on a daily basis. They are doing what they're supposed to, lesson planning, supervising children, cleaning tables, all those types of things. And that's through informal supervision and mentoring. If job performance is an issue, then you're going to do some kind of formal communication of a measurable and achievable way to improve job performance. I have a plan of action. Sometimes it's called a PIP, performance improvement plan, but I have one that we did on 150, and it's a template and an example of it, and that will be on Canvas. So if you didn't take 150, or you want a refresher, or you just want to look at it again, it is on Canvas. It's my own personal plan of action, but I am letting you guys use it. Once again, this would be the starting off point if you are in an organization and you'd like to use this. This would be the starting off point in using something like this. You would need to clear it with HR if needed, or with a consultant or something like that, but feel free to go ahead and use it or use parts of it. But this is a way to be measurable and achievable with our job performance. So if it was something like being tardy, so somebody is always late, 10 to 15 minutes late, that's impacting breaks, lunches, things like that. So they're late to their shift. How would you do a measurable and achievable way to improve their job performance? And there's the template, and then the example I give is on tardiness, and that is up on Canvas for you guys to take a look at. So in your plan of action, what you're doing is before termination. So you're really wanting to give them the opportunity to show that they can do better. And this is if it's not an egregious breach of contract or conduct, and we'll talk about that later. So attendance would be an issue, behavior, communicating with coworkers or customers, performance, the ability to do your job, if they're not providing positive guidance to the children, their discipline is too harsh, supervision out on the playground, they're not supposed to be where they are, too much chit-chatting, those types of things. All reasons that you could put somebody on a plan of action or a performance improvement plan and then this is where you're very achievable and you're very measurable in your steps, and that's why I have an example on Canvas so you can go ahead and see it. Sometimes though, it's like I said, it's an egregious breach. Like there's no coming back from this. What they did was so serious that they need to immediately be terminated. A lot of times this is supervision of children. So if a child has been left on the playground unsupervised, left in a classroom unsupervised, leaves the classroom unsupervised, that's typically an immediate termination, and that would be noted in the job contract that you have with the child, is that supervision of children. And that's why I kind of touched on it a bit in job descriptions and job contracts, is keeping children healthy and safe is the bare minimum of any position. If you can't do that, you probably should not be employed with children at this time in this classroom. That's not to say that you can't come back from it and you can't try again in another site, but you're definitely going to have learned from that experience of being fired for having a child be unsupervised. Sometimes it's inappropriate conduct as well with children, families, or staff, either verbal or physical. Obviously, with physical issues, striking a child, hitting a child, grabbing a child by the arm, giving pressure to a child, like a lot of times you'll see people holding hands too tight as a way to kind of get their attention, they say, but it's quite obvious that it's a discipline technique, and that is inappropriate as well. But it can be verbal as well, speaking harshly, threatening a child. I did fire somebody who threatened a child with a vacuum cleaner. He had an irrational fear at 3 years old, vacuum cleaners like a lot of children do, and she was overheard by another staff member, and then we also heard it on the video cameras that we have, saying if he didn't do such and such, stop hitting his friend or listen to her, she was going to get the vacuum cleaner up and vacuum him up. We fired her that afternoon. As soon as we found out about this, we looked on the video camera, we heard it ourselves, we brought her in, we had her watch it, and we said, your services here as a teacher are no longer welcome. And then we made the plans to have her check cut, and she walked out the door, and she was no longer with us. The same type of thing years and years ago. I had a staff member who was walking a child to school. They was our morning staff member. He was not listening, and she grabbed his hand very, very tightly and squeezed it really hard to the point that he cried, as a way to keep him in line and keep him listening to her on the way to the school. In that kind of situation, this was the second complaint that we had had from a child that this had happened, and she had been warned and put on a performance improvement plan where we worked on positive guidance and discipline and safety and being positive with safety on roads and things like that. And in this second complaint from a child where somebody did kind of see the child crying and complaining about it, we terminated her as well. So those are examples. It can be with parents or families. It could even be with yourself as a management person if they were really threatening or inappropriate with you or another staff member. These are the types of things where I can give lots of examples that I've lived, but it's one of the things that you have to live as well. So it's usually if somebody's inappropriate, they're too harsh, or they're not supervising children, or they're putting children in situations where they cannot be kept safe or healthy, that we need to immediately terminate them. It also needs to violate the job contract. So you can't just make up something. You can't be like, man, I really dislike this person. I don't want them in my program anymore. I'm going to say that they didn't do their lesson plans for the third week in a row, you're fired. If that's not on your job contract, or you haven't given a plan of action, that can be seen as discrimination, can be seen as picking on somebody, something like that. So if you're immediately terminating somebody, it needs to be something in the job contract that was really serious enough that they couldn't return as a teacher. So in our termination policy, we're going to write one. And this is a termination policy for staff members. And the most important thing with our termination policy is it's written for everybody, so it's standardized for all employees, because this is going to help you prevent discrimination, which then minimizes your liability. So if somebody was to come to you and be like, you discriminated against so-and-so, you could use your termination policy that's for all staff and was given to all staff and signed by all staff, saying how and why you terminate as a reason that you are not discriminating. You followed your policy to a T, and that's why this person was let go. So when you are actually terminating, I think that you should involve a team, or at least another person, to witness the termination. In larger programs, if you're a director and you have an assistant director or a mentor teacher or a lead teacher, that would be the person to involve in it. I know in other programs, you might be the only management person. So once again, trying to find a mentor or a lead or somebody who has the ability to remain impartial, to remain patient and calm in something, when you're terminating somebody, it's not a great conversation. So somebody that you think has enough maturity and enough experience and wisdom to kind of go through that. I'm not saying that it's not a younger staff member, but it's somebody that you really trust to remain respectful during this process. For our FCC providers, it's typically just you, and if you have, if you're a large family home and you have another person, if you can get maybe, and I think that's why having a network is so important, if you knew that this was going to happen, having somebody from another site, another program, another FCC home that you know of who could come by and do it with you at lunch or after work or something like that is probably going to be the best way to go, because you have somebody who's a professional in the field who can also give you their experience as well. So you're like, if you're on the fence about if you can keep this person, somebody who works in an FCC that's part of your professional network would be a good resource for, should I fire, should I not fire? They'll know a little bit more about your situations and kind of the strengths and issues of running your own FCC home. I think when you can do that as well, it looks a little bit more professional for the person who is being fired, and then the ideas of discrimination and things like that can be minimized as well. Sometimes it does have to be your husband or a family member who lives in the home who's going to witness the termination, and that's fine as well. I just think that there should be a second person, so it doesn't turn into a he said, she said, like the person who's being fired might be able to turn around and say that you were inappropriate or you said things that were wrong, and in this case you can minimize it by having another person present. You should remain compassionate and respectful and give them the reason for termination and the practical information behind it. So kind of the worst firing that I ever did was like a week before Christmas, and that was really hard. But when you are mean to an infant, and that's kind of what this was. It was an infant caregiver and somebody who was was not picking up a child who was crying because they thought that the 6-month-old knew better or was just doing it for attention and things like that. So when you are mean to an infant and you prevent other people from picking up an infant who was crying out of distress, then you are going to have an immediate termination, at least with me. And it was hard because it was right before Christmas. And if it had been another situation, I might have let that go on for another 2 weeks, 3 weeks. But in this kind of situation, I didn't want our infants to be in the care of somebody who thought that 6-month-old cried for attention. So we had to do that. It was hard, and I needed to remain respectful. She was very, very upset. It's the closest I've ever actually gotten to having to call law enforcement in a termination procedure. But I just needed to kind of take a deep breath as it kind of dragged out and know that she was losing a full-time position. It was right before Christmas. Was she going to be able to find a new position? It was a big deal and a big reason that she had been let go. She could never use us for a letter of recommendation. We would not have given her a good one, and we would have been honest about the reasons of her termination. And this was a 6-year position that she was in. This is a big gap in her resume. So I needed to take a big, deep breath and realize that there were a lot of implications in her life. She was probably going to need to move on from early childhood education at that point. That was probably a good reason in her mind. But at that moment when you are being fired, that seems life-changing. You're going to have to go into a different field. You're going to have to do it right before Christmas. How are you going to pay for presents? Things like that. So I needed to understand and see it from her point of view, even though I knew that I had made the right decision and she did need to leave. Sometimes, and that was like an immediate termination, gone in one day, because we noticed that we found out that this was happening. If it's an end result of a plan of action, you're documenting the job performance, and you're documenting the times that she was late, evidence that she was late, like printouts from, the login procedure, login system that you have on the computer, because by the agreed upon date, and that's usually what you have on a plan of action is, by June 2nd, this person will have not been late more than 5 minutes in a 60-day period, something like that. So if they are late 5 times in a 60-day period, you've documented that job performance, and that is part of their employee file. So it's placed in their employee file. They are told the reason. You are, you're constantly late. You're on a plan of action. You were late on April 2nd, April 19th, April 20th, you were out completely, you know, on this day, or no show, no call, you know, things like that. I think it's really important in both immediate terminations and terminations with a performance plan that we give them the reason for their termination and any practical information that they want to know. And that's why we have the termination policy as well, is that we are following the policy that we have set for ourselves. With our immediate termination as well, you should write down and you should document the serious concerns. It's nice when we have video cameras in the classroom because you can download and save those, or you can just have the employee who witnessed it or you witnessed or something writing down the concerns that you have and the reasons why, and that also is placed in the employee file as well. Those types of things minimize your liability. So if they were to come back and say that their hiring was unethical or unlawful, you have documentation to prove why you did this, how you did this, and that you follow the termination policy. So the online assignment is to write a staff policy for termination. So this is explaining to staff, and it would be part of the handbook, why and how an employee might be terminated. It's important that the process is standardized as much as possible. Make sure employees are not being discriminated against. Include both involuntary and voluntary termination policy, and I'm going to give you a template, and I'm going to show you right now. It's part of why I wanted to do this was so part of what I wanted to kind of do this format with my face and everything is so that I can change the screen a lot, so I can show you templates and things like that. Because I remember teaching online, sometimes I need to just be able to explain things a little bit better and show you Canvas or show you Word documents. So that's why I'm using kind of this format. So this is what you're going to see this week on Canvas. So I have information. It's about the purpose, at-will employment. So this is California. We're an at-will state. This means that you can fire anybody or you can terminate their employment with or without cause or without notice at any time. It talks about voluntary terminations. So if somebody's just leaving you, they're quitting, how many weeks notice do you want? 2 weeks is typical. I put with management 4. That's what I like. I have not given that in the past as a management, and I have now felt very bad about that. It is really hard to find an assistant director, administrative position, or anything like that in 2 weeks. So if you know that you are going to be moving on, giving as much notice as possible is always the best type of thing. But for your staff members, how many weeks notice do you prefer? So in this spot right here where it says procedures 1, because you're going to fill out the areas that are red, how many weeks notice do you prefer? So employees will give 2 weeks notice, you know, something like that. Who's the contact person like this? So who are they writing a letter to and telling verbally that they're leaving? How are you going to contact that person? So this is where you're going to go into kind of those information that you're going to contact management within 2 weeks by letter and in person to let them know that you will be terminating your employment. Because remember, this is voluntary. You're going back to school, your child is being born, or you're just moving on, you know, something like that. So this is how you would tell people if they are going to be retiring or moving on from here. Involuntary terminations. So involuntary termination, we talked about again, is you are being fired. So the first one is going to be about plan of actions. So talking about when are you going to use it a plan of action? When is it appropriate? When will they have a chance to rebut against it, you know, things like that. What are all the issues with plan of actions or performance improvement plans? And then the second one is giving the employee the reason why they're terminated. I think that's a good point, and I think that you can decide. If you don't want to give them the reason, you don't have to. It's a standard practice typically, though, to give an employee the reasons why they are being terminated. And I would say that you should do that. And then what happens if the employee needs to be terminated right away? So if it's an immediate termination, how will the employee be notified of their termination? How will they be told? What is the process of that? So there's 3 in this involuntary one that you're going to think about and talk about and write some policies about plan of action, terminations, and then immediate termination. And then I've put some other part about final pay, because you do have to pay final pay. You can't withhold any money that they've made. If you fired them at 3 o'clock on a Friday, you have to pay them up until they worked at 3. And then it also talks about employer's death. You have to pay if somebody dies, not at your center. I mean, that could happen. I've heard of that happening once. But if an employee dies in any kind of circumstances, you still have to pay their final pay, and it either goes to an estate or a next of kin or something like that. I do have my disclaimer here at the end that this is just a worksheet. It's understanding basic management ideas, including termination. So this is the first step in learning termination procedures and shouldn't be used outside of this classroom environment. It shouldn't be reproduced or used by students to terminate employees in their workplace. This is just a learning document for you to think about and explore the ideas of termination. Please do not use this. It depends on the type of organization that you run, the type of center that you run. So while we are an at-will state, there might be information that you would need to know more about, such as if you work for a union, then if you So if you worked for a union, then that might be an issue as well. And you would need to have new, okay, so why you cannot use that worksheet in the assignment for this week is because there might be specific situations. So if your employees are unionized, unions are great. I'm in a lot of unions for all of my teaching positions. Unions protect me. They're a bargaining unit. They get us raises. So I'm not anti-union, but if you work with a union or your employees are in a union, you're going to have a specific job contract with them and termination procedures with them and things like that. So those are things that you're going to need to be aware of. So that's why this worksheet, this online assignment, is just the idea and the learning environment that I have created for us in this virtual space so we can work on it together. It shouldn't be used because you might have really specific situations in your workplace that I don't know about, and so you would need to have a termination policy drafted by HR or a lawyer or something like that. All right, so we also have some specific laws in California. The big one is that you have to pay all of their wages owed at the time of termination, and this includes paid time off, accrued and unused vacation, stuff like that. Very standard. That's why you get a last check. You cut them a check with all of the things that you owe them. So termination law as well, and this is for California. Last semester I had somebody in Hawaii. I didn't even know until like the last 3 or 4 weeks. They started out in California and then they moved halfway through. So if you are in Arizona, Hawaii, Nevada, something like this, this is specific to California. I don't know what it is in other states. California is an at-will state, meaning that the employee may be terminated with or without cause at any time and for any lawful reason with or without advance notice. So lawful reason. So an unlawful reason would be I don't like you, or you look weird, or you smell, something like that. It has to be a significant and lawful reason. And you don't have to give notice as well, and that's why we have plan of action. So there might be notice. So we're working on it. I'd like to keep you employed, but you have to do these certain things, and that's why we have a plan of action. And then without notice, you were mean to a child, you're gone. So some exceptions or things to be aware of are, once again, if you're part of a union, if you are let go within a union, they'll probably, if they can, negotiate on your behalf, especially if they think that it's unlawful. And once again, I'm very pro-union, but they have specific workplace things that they advocate and negotiate for their workers on. If you are part of a protected class, or you can't fire somebody if they are in retaliation for engaging in a protected activity. So if they are complaining about discrimination or complaining about wage issues or whistleblowing. So if somebody was agitating for more pay in the classroom, you couldn't discriminate by firing that person just because they asked for $19 an hour and you couldn't pay that and they were trying to organize people. You would still need to keep that person employed if they were doing a good job in the classroom. Or complaining about discrimination if they pointed out that all of the teachers had green eyes, blonde hair, were 5'7" and weighed 130 pounds, that as well. If this person didn't fit into that kind of look, but was doing a great job in the classroom, then by complaining about discrimination, that could be an issue as well. So I'm not saying in protected classes that these people should not and cannot be fired. What I'm saying is that you need to terminate correctly. And a protected class is age, typically an older age, race, a disability, national origin, so where you're born, if you're pregnant, and what your sex or gender is. So those are kind of protected classes. So EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, it's a federal commission, and they look at and they prevent discrimination. So if you felt that you were in a protected class and you were discriminated against, you would file an EEOC complaint. And what that would be is they would look at the issues and they would look at if you were discriminated against. So for example, if you were a fantastic employee, but you were 6 months pregnant, you didn't feel you had done anything wrong and you were fired, then you might want to file an EEOC complaint saying that, you know, you are fired just for being pregnant, and then they would look into it. And this is a great organization. It's a great part of the federal government because it does help our groups from discrimination. I only bring this up when we're talking about termination is because just because you are in a protected class does not mean that you cannot be terminated. You just need to make sure that you are doing it correctly. And so this is their website, eeoc.gov, and they are a fantastic resource for this. I definitely agree. I definitely urge everybody to go to that website, especially if you're a small business owner, and get to know those laws and liability. They have fantastic websites. Like they have ones just for small business owners. They have one for people who have a little bit more employees or a little bit less employees, but they have a lot of information. So I think it's a fantastic resource for all of us to learn more about how to protect our employees, especially from harassment. So this is the first time I'm ever kind of touching on this in a lecture. I think over the last couple of years, we've had a lot more attention, and we kind of live in a post-Harvey Weinstein world. We're talking more about harassment and issues like that. And so I think that EEOC, because they handle harassment, is a good resource, and that's a reason maybe even if you're not a small business owner, you work in a Head Start or a nonprofit, knowing about this and knowing about what the legal definition of harassment is will benefit you as management. So harassment is really unwelcome conduct based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, disability, or genetic information. So it's unlawful if it's offensive conduct, and that's part of your continued employment. So if you walked into the break room every day and somebody had a smart comment about your race or your disability or your age or your hair color or something like that on a daily basis that was part of your employment, then that could be considered harassment in the workplace. If it's pervasive or severe enough to create a workplace or a work environment that's hostile or abusive, that is also harassment as well. So you as a management person cannot harass your employees. You shouldn't be making a hostile or abusive workplace or work environment, and you can't allow an employee to be harassed by others. And this includes sexual harassment, and that is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. So obviously you should not be doing this to your employers and employees, and your employees shouldn't be doing it to each other. Since this is my first time lecturing about it, I did kind of want to touch on the fact that sometimes we can be sexually harassed or harassed in general by families. It is rare, but talking to people that I have worked with and myself, I have been sexually harassed by a parent before. And I've highlighted it down here is, you know, the client and the customer, and then I have this arrow coming up here that if it's teasing, an offhand comment, or isolated incidents are not really considered harassment. But if it happens so frequently or severely that it then affects your work environment, then that could be an adverse workplace. And that's the sexual harassment that me and a couple of other people that I've worked in the industry have kind of experienced, is a parent or a family member who teases, who has constant offhand comments, or just isolated incidents where they get too close or they touch you in a way that feels inappropriate. And so I don't know where I'm kind of I guess I just want to bring this up since this is kind of my first time lecturing about this. I want to acknowledge that harassment can happen in our workplace. Just because we work with children, just because we have big hearts, doesn't mean that harassment or discrimination isn't going to take place. It can take place in any workplace. Sexual harassment can take place in any workplace as well, either between management and employees, or unfortunately between our clients and customers. And I think the fact that we take care of their children makes it more awkward, more difficult, and more scary to come forward and say that something like this happened. You know, mine was kind of those teasing things that happened so much, or standing too close, and it happened so much that I felt really, really uncomfortable around this parent. Looks and glances and things like that, whereas it never came out and was like, you know, there was no request for a sexual favor. There was nothing really like significant but it was enough that I felt uncomfortable and that this parent was being inappropriate with me. Many of you might have experienced this as well. And I think now looking back, having this happen, you know, 15 years ago, in this one case that I'm thinking about, that I wish that I had gone to my director, and I wish that she could have made a difference in that. You know, a simple word with the parent he probably would have understood, like, oh my God, I didn't even realize I was making her uncomfortable, or I'll knock it off right now. And if he said, well, I didn't do anything wrong, you know, then if it continued to happen, then there should have been steps beyond that. So I know that I would try to protect my employees who were going through anything, either employees harassing employees, or other management harassing my employees, or families harassing my employees. I know as a director, you know, the buck stops here. I need to be the one that's going to protect you. So if you are becoming a director, or if you're a teacher, I just want us to kind of have this idea that we are working together. We need to acknowledge that harassment and discrimination happens in all industries across the board. It can happen in education. I hope that it doesn't, but if it does, we need to protect ourselves, and we need to protect the people that we work with. So you must respond and protect employees from discrimination and harassment. EEOC has policies, and that's why this government group is great. If you go to the website, you will see how they can help protect people from harassment and discrimination. Because really, at the end of the day, we want to create a supportive and protected workplace by taking allegations of harassment seriously. So I have had employees bring to me harassment from another employee, and so I was really lucky in that I had a human resources department. So we took the videotapes from the incidents and questions, saved it, put it on a thumb drive, on 2 different thumb drives, one we kept at our location, and then one we sent up our chain of command, and we let human resources handle harassment and discrimination. And that's really helpful, is that, you know, human resources, they went to school for this 4 years about these types of management issues, human resources, personnel issues, and so they were able to help us with that. Sometimes though, it's just you, and that's why you need to know about EEOC. You need to know that you're supposed to protect your employees, and you also need to probably talk to somebody else about these types of situations. EEO as well does a fantastic job with personnel policy of all types. So if you need a non-discrimination policy, a harassment policy, reasonable accommodation policy, leave policy, go to the EEO website, eeoc.gov. They have all of this policy already written for you, so that you can kind of see about what you need to have in your employee file, or things that you need to let your employees know about. You should have something general like this in most of your employee handbook, and that's why EEOC is so great, is that they have a website area for small business owners to give you information about this. For a lot of us, if you're in a bigger organization, you have your HR department who's written this for you, but once again, if you're out on your lonesome, this is going to help you. I do want to talk about grievance procedures. I kind of forgot that I even had lived within this situation. We had grievance procedures on Camp Pendleton. So we were a military organization, federally funded, so we needed to have grievance procedures. And what it is it's a way to have like dispute resolution. A lot of times it's internal. An employee has his or her grievances addressed, but it can be for employers, employees, families, or suppliers. And it is a formal process. So a lot of times you would hope that this would start informally. I'm really upset that this happened. You treated me unfairly because, or a family, I'm upset with you because you're not open till 7 and I get off at 6:59. You know, something like that. So typically we like our complaints to be informal, try to handle it. If informally we cannot handle it, we typically in a larger organization have to go through the formal process of a grievance. They're often used in unions. So once again, if you are working with unionized employees, there's going to be some kind of grievance procedure. And then if it's federal, state, or county government, or people who use a lot of different vendors, you will also have very set grievance procedures. So I want to give you an example of a grievance procedure. So this first one is actually my younger sister had this happen to her last year. So my sister had a good performance review at 3 months. So she'd been there for about 4 years. 3 months ago, she had a great performance review, a lot of met expectations, exceeded expectations. Nothing was underneath expectations. So she was a solid employee. She was called into a meeting with just her immediate supervisor, and her immediate supervisor put her on a plan of action. My sister said, no, I will not sign this plan of action. I don't think that this is fair. She wrote a letter to her human resources department disputing the reasons for the plan of action and cited her past performance review and no other documented issues. There was no plan of action or anything like this, and how she felt it was not appropriate. HR concluded they had her file a formal grievance procedure, so she formally kind of outlined these types of things beyond the letter she had already written, and then the plan of action from her immediate supervisor was then withdrawn, and it was like it had never happened. So she works for a very large organization. It's partially state funded. It's in a completely different industry. She lives in San Francisco. She works in science. But it was a large organization, and so they had a grievance procedure and a huge human resources department that she was able to use when she felt that her employer was being unfair with her. Also in a large organization, a family could file a grievance procedure. For example, a lot of times you'll see this with family service organizations, adoption organizations, things like that. If they feel that they were discriminated against in an adoption, this was a recent court case that I saw where they brought a formal grievance procedure against a local family service organization because they felt that they were passed over in adoption processes because they were a lesbian couple, and so they felt that they weren't having children placed with them in adoption because the religious family service organization was discriminating against them. So that was a court case that I saw recently. And then also suppliers will file grievance complaints if their contract is ended. So let's say you have Hollandia Dairy and you are a large like Head Start. If you ended your contract with them, they might file a grievance complaint with the organization as a whole, wanting to know why, you know, this lucrative money contract was maybe given to a competitor or ended or something like that. So this is an example of a procedure flow chart. And once again, you might not have grievance procedures. If you're a smaller organization, you might not have something like this, but you probably need to be aware of the fact that if you cannot resolve issues or complaints or disputes informally and internally, then you will have to have some kind of formal grievance procedure in order to resolve the complaint that they have. And each one is going to be very different depending on your organization. So the types of employees you have, the types of unions or suppliers that you have. Not every organization will have one, but it's smart to be aware of how to handle complaints and disputes. So once again, this image on the left-hand side is a grievance procedure flow chart for a very specific, this is for college employees. So I wanted to give you an example that's education adjacent. It's kind of similar to what we have, but that each one is going to be a little bit different. So requesting informal resolution, looking at your supervisor, filing formal grievance, there's a response, it goes to the president. So there's steps, and there's a mediated and very prescribed step for every part of the formal grievance procedure. And that's why a lot of places won't have a formal one, but you just need to be aware of it. Typically it includes these steps: writing a letter to your employer. So once again, in my sister's situation, she wrote a letter to her human resources telling them the detail of her grievance and how she didn't agree with the plan of action. Then she had a meeting with her employer and her human resources to discuss the issue. And then she appealed the decision, her employer's decision, with their formal kind of grievance procedure that she had to write out in a specific way that HR wanted to want it. I do have a very broad example. It's from Workable, which is an online source, and that's on Canvas as well. So if this is something that you think you need or something that your organization already has but you don't know a lot about, looking at this example on Canvas will help you. So in conclusion, it's really important, and it's probably the most important in all these areas. We want everything to be standardized, and we want things to be formal. We don't just want it to be willy-nilly, come on in, do whatever you want. I treat one employee differently than I teach another. Each classroom's different, do what you want. And it's probably not a great way to run your business and your organization. But this is the area that it probably matters the most, is that it's standardized and formal when you are terminating an employee, because you don't want to be held liable or you don't want to be accused of discrimination. So we want to be able to keep our qualified and quality staff and remove staff who cannot work within the standards of your program. So if they can't fulfill your job contract and their job description, and they don't have, and they've been given a chance to change, they don't have a place within your program. If they can't keep children healthy and safe, then they most likely need to have a plan of action or immediate termination from your place of employment. It just needs to make sure that it's standardized and it's formal, and you have a policy that staff knows about termination ahead of the game in the employee handbook when they are hired, so they know what the end result of not fulfilling their job contract will be. Is that will be a termination. I think it's really important, and it's, you know, in this post-Harvey Weinstein world, Time's Out, all that type of stuff, I am trying to bring more awareness of harassment and discrimination to our field, to our industry, so that we can protect our program, we can protect our staff members, protect our employees, so that we have the best workplace possible. It's hard to work with children all day. And there are things can happen outside of the workplace, outside of working with children, that can make our workplace feel unsafe or hostile or abusive. And we want to minimize that so that we are taking care of our employees, so that they can go and they can take care of the children in their care. All right, so to do this week, please write a plan of action. So I've shown you the template. So I shared the screen, I showed you an example of you're filling out the areas in red. I also have the grievance procedures and plan of action templates on Canvas that you can read so that you can learn more about it. And then we're also going to be having a group project week. So this week, instead of a discussion board for the whole group, we're going to be doing it in our group projects. We only have a couple more weeks. We are in the beginning of April. By the beginning of May, you're going to want to have this wrapped up so that you can start narrating. So please, by email, on Canvas, on Google Documents, please make sure that your slides are being written so that you can finish them probably in the next 3 to 4 weeks so that they can start being narrated. Thanks so much, and have a great